friends, and welcome to episode 24 of the Yogic Studies podcast. I'm your host, Seth Powell, and today we are joined by Jvala Singh from UC Berkeley and the University of British Columbia. In today's episode, Jvala and I had a wide-ranging conversation about the history of Sikhism, or Sikhi, his background growing up in the Sikh community in Canada, studying languages like Sanskrit, Punjabi, and Brajbhāṣā. We talk about his time spent with a Sikh guru at his ashram in northern India. And we get to his doctoral research at UBC on pre-colonial Sikh texts and their history, such as the Sūraj Prakāś. We talk about the role of yoga within Sikh traditions. Is there a Sikh yoga tradition? As well as a more broader conversation about making Sikh scholarship, making the languages and texts accessible to the broader public and Sikh community. As we discuss in today's episode, Jvala will be teaching a new online course for us at Yogic Studies entitled YS116, Sikhism and Yoga. The course runs live from May 31st through June 25th. And listeners can find out more and register for the course by going to yogicstudies.com/YS-116. Jvala Singh is a lecturer for UC Berkeley at the Institute for South Asia Studies. He's currently completing his PhD at the University of British Columbia, where he's examining pre-colonial Sikh historical narratives. His research explores literature in Punjabi and Brajbhāṣā from the 18th and 19th centuries, building off his previous MA research, which was completed at the University of Toronto, where he focused on Sikh Brajbhāṣā versions of the Sanskrit epics, such as the Rāmāyaṇa. In furthering the accessibility of pre-colonial Sikh Brajbhāṣā texts, Jvala Singh runs the Sūraj Podcast, where each episode is a chapter summary in English of the voluminous Sūraj Prakāś. Composed in 1843 by Santokh Singh, this is a historical narrative covering the lives of the 10 Sikh gurus. So please go check out Jvala's podcast, the Sūraj Prakāś, if you haven't already. All right, without further ado, let's get to today's episode with Jvala Singh. All right, I am joined here today by Jvala Singh. Jvala, welcome to the Yogic Studies podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing today?
Good, how are you? And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm doing good. Sunny Thursday morning here in California. Where are you joining us from today?
Out right next to Vancouver, so Surrey, British Columbia. So not as sunny as California, but still a nice day.
Well, as I was saying before we hit record, it's a little too sunny here, a little too soon. So, but we won't get into all of that. But it's been a hot one out here. But Jvala, it's really nice to have you here to connect. We're excited about your upcoming course that you're going to be teaching at Yogic Studies on Sikhism and Yoga. And I'm really excited just to have you here to talk about your research, your background. We'll preview the course, and we'll kind of talk about all things Sikhism and discussing this interesting question and, trying to unpack and understand the role of yoga or the place of yoga within these traditions. Before we get started with all of that, I was just thinking before the pod here, we first met through our mutual friend and colleague, Philip de Slip. Philip's kind of one of my oldest grad school friends. He's, of course, been on the podcast. He has taught for us at Yogic Studies. How did you first meet Philip? And how did that connection come about?
I think we first met in California, actually, where I think I was presenting at a conference at Stanford University called Scholars. And we met in person there. Once I heard about his work, studying, yoga traditions in America. And then he was talking about Bhagat Singh Thind, and he was talking about Yogi Bhajan. And, I found his work really interesting. His work is, super pertinent today, especially with, the knowledge coming out about, the scandals about the 3HO organization.
Mm.
And, Philip is, he's a pioneer there. He's on the forefront, taking the blast, taking the heat from that.
Mm.
But, yeah, he's a great guy, and he's just always, spoken and researched with integrity. And yeah, I've just been a fan of his work, as well as being a friend with him.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe we'll have time at the end today when we get to kind of some modern day issues. Maybe we'll circle back around to some of that stuff. Well, yeah, I was grateful for the connection because this is an area within yogic studies and within, I would say, within the study of yoga more broadly. Sikhism, I think, is an underlooked or overlooked kind of area of research. And so I think there's a little bit of activity I've seen within yoga studies more broadly that's starting to trickle out, but I think it's an area and a site for future research. And I hope that this conversation and this course can help kind of start to move us in those directions. Okay, let me ask you a quick question right off the bat. Sikhism or Sikhism? Sikh or Sikh?
So, I mean, you study Sanskrit, you know the word shish, right? The word shish is the root of where Sikh comes from. It's just that in the Punjab region, those who have not studied Sanskrit, it's not in their repertoire to say that retroflex sh. So they replace that with a k sound. And that's how shish becomes Sikh. So in the Western, diaspora, people have started saying Sikh instead, to make it more clear, obviously, so the word doesn't get confused with like illness. But
right,
in actuality, it's Sikh. People say Sikhism, or you'll hear scholars also say Sikhi, meaning the study or the teachings of, you could say in quotes, Sikhism.
Do you think did the mispronunciation, kind of the long E, Sikh, did that start with British kind of colonialists and administrators during the Raj mispronouncing that, and then that kind of Anglophonization got exported?
It's quite possible. I mean, I'm not quite sure the origins of that. Certainly, when people were pronouncing Punjab, they pronounced it as Punjab, as Punjab. There's certain that certainly was, the British mispronouncing that. But you will hear Sikhs in the Western areas saying Sikh or Sikhism, and that's even a habit. Sometimes it becomes difficult to kind of unlearn when you've heard it like that. Even for myself, sometimes in a certain context,
Right.
just to make it clear to whoever I'm talking to, I might have mistakenly said Sikh.
Right.
So
yeah, I wanted to ask you about that.
I mean,
because I find the same thing with certain Sanskrit terms, just kind of in the yoga world. You almost find yourself defaulting to the mispronunciation because you want to be intelligible. You want the person to know what you're saying, and you don't want to have to, every time you say the word, to explain what you're saying, right? But at the same time, you want to model the correct pronunciation and honoring the tradition and so forth.
Yeah, you see it when people say Sanskrit, right, instead of Sanskrit. So, those type of things. To be honest, for me, I don't get too fed up on it, but yeah, the correct one would be Sikh or Sikhi.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for clarifying that. So tell us a little bit about kind of where you're at right now in your career, and you're at University of British Columbia. Is that right? Working on your PhD. Tell us a little bit about kind of what you're up to these days.
Yeah, so currently I'm studying at University of British Columbia. I am studying Sikh historical narratives. For those in academia, I'm currently in my comprehensive exam stage. So this comes just before the dissertation. And I'll also be joining you, Seth, out there in California. I got a position at UC Berkeley for this September. So I'll be teaching while finishing up the PhD at UBC. And like I said, I'm studying Sikh historical narrative. So the major text that I'm looking at is kind of an epic amongst Sikh literary tradition. It's called the Sūraj Prakāś. It's a historical narrative covering the lives of the 10 living gurus, from the first guru who, birthed the Sikh tradition, Guru Nanak, and then all the way till the last guru, Guru Gobind Singh, who passed away in 1708. And these stories, there's so many stories. There's up to 60,000 verses just dedicated to this history. So it's a gigantic text.
That's a big text to to take on then for a PhD project, right?
Absolutely. There's ways I'm gonna have to just look at it in a smaller way to kind of condense the text and situate it in history without kind of looking at every single page of it. But for those who have seen the podcast that I run, the Sūraj podcast, what I do on there is I kind of narrate each chapter, and record it as an episode. So each episode is just one chapter from that text. And my goal is to kind of get through as much as I can throughout my studies. Currently, we are looking at the life stories of Guru Hargobind. So this is the sixth guru in the Sikh tradition.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love what you've done then with the podcast, the Sūraj Prakāś, or it's the Sūraj podcast, excuse me. But looking at the Sūraj Prakāś, I didn't realize at first that was like the text that you were working on for your dissertation. But what a brilliant idea to kind of basically turn your dissertation work, your research into a podcast form to kind of give you little mini translation goals to keep you kind of moving through the text, but then to polish that and to share it with the broader public and Sikhi community. What's that experience been like of entering into podcasting and kind of sharing your research with the broader public?
To be honest, in regards to the podcasting, I kind of stumbled into it. It was the suggestion of a couple of friends who I had sent. So as I would just normally be going through this text as a part of my research, every, once in a while, I would send an audio clip just on WhatsApp to like a bunch of friends in a friend group. And it'd be like, hey, this happened in this chapter. This is really funny, or this is interesting. What happened here? This is what the text says. Eventually, they all convinced me to, why don't you just record all of the episodes? Like this episode that you're talking about, I'll put music behind it. So I have, my brother helping me with the audio. I have other friends helping with design for images and stuff like that. So we came up with this idea of why don't we just make a podcast out of this? And this is why we have started in kind of an odd spot halfway through the life of one of the gurus. And we had then completed that, and then we circled back to kind of start at the beginning of the guru's life as well, Guru Hargobind. So I kind of stumbled into the podcast arena, but sharing work online has been something that I've been doing, I think, for more than 10 years now. I have been running this blog. It's called manglacharan.com. And what I've been doing there is, as I would be reading texts, I would translate them. And then, I always thought, if I'm translating this for myself, if I want to understand this, how much extra work would it be to just share that with other people? Technology has made it so easy to run a blog and all this. So I started just, posting, small passages from texts from the Sikh tradition that have never been translated into English before. And I think early on, I realized, when I was probably in my teens, that there's such a big gap between what is presented in the West online for people who are not proficient in some of the languages to understand Sikh history and Sikh philosophy, and what does get presented, and I thought it was really one-sided. And I thought, it would be good to fill in that gap, slowly, just post translations to show people, what is out there? What are the historical texts that people used to base their language, their beliefs and notions of history upon? So So yeah, I've been running that blog for about 10 years now. We have a Patreon page, and there's over 130 people who have been supporting that effort as well. So yeah, I'm just thankful to those people who have been supporting my work that way for quite a long time.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I've taken a look at the blog and the YouTube page as well, and I really enjoy just like the aesthetic of the videos. They're very fresh, beautiful imagery, nice typography. Putting the Punjabi and the English translation, and then sometimes you just got some really nice music, a nice beat or a track to it. Sometimes a little hip hop in there, and I think you're doing something nice there. That is kind of bringing this traditional history, this deep, rich knowledge, but making it accessible to kind of a digital age. And in many ways, we're trying to do that in different ways with yogic studies. So that really kind of fits into the vision of what we're trying to do as well in yoga studies and in the yoga world. Because, yeah, as you said, there's often a huge gap between what the academics are doing in this kind of deep research and then the way discourse in yoga studios and practice centers, around yoga and around the history and philosophy, about the way in which knowledge spreads there. So trying to fill those gaps. So tell us a little bit more about your story and your background. How did you become a scholar of the Sikh tradition, studying languages and going on to do a PhD on this history? Take us back a little bit and kind of tell us how you got here today.
Well, growing up, like I mentioned, I was always curious about history and philosophy, and I had a general interest, I think, sprouted in me from my father. And growing through my teens, I would kind of look through material, what was available. I was kind of unimpressed what was available in English. Just knowing that we have such a rich history, I was aware of some of the old historical texts and some of the other important literature in the tradition. But I always struggled with language. I'll be honest. Like in my teens, I didn't really understand what was there.
Where did you grow up, Jvala?
So I was born and raised in Ottawa. I have a connection with England. I'm there every year because I have a lot of family outside of London. And yeah, so I grew up in Ottawa. I struggled with understanding Punjabi growing up. I struggled with understanding the languages that were used in these historical texts. But I could listen to Katha, discourse, by certain scholars. And that kind of led me down this path. I was fortunate enough to meet a very esteemed scholar in one of the traditional institutional lineages of scholarship, just by chance, actually, in Toronto, who he would visit Toronto every year, but he's kind of a celibate scholar who has like this little like dera, like ashram, basically a bunga teaching institution out in India outside of Chandigarh. And I met him luckily through a friend. Over the next couple of years, then I would, keep talking to him. Eventually, after my undergrad, I studied political science. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. I was thinking I would go into, law school. But after my undergrad, I took the opportunity, took some time off, and I just spent 6 months in India with him there, living there at that little teaching institution. And every day we would look through Sikh literature.
Was that your first time in India, or did you go as as a youth?
I didn't go when I was young. I went once when I was like 12 or 13 with my father and my grandfather, and I hated it. I thought it was terrible. Yeah. I thought it was so hot. I thought it was dirty. Like I grew up in Ottawa. I was just, it didn't appeal to me at all.
Right.
But whatever the reason was, after that, when I came back home, I started reading more about Sikh history, Sikh thought, and eventually it peaked. I think I was 18, 19 when I went back, and I spent a good month or two just traveling around with some friends out in England who joined me. And we were living in kind of the roughest conditions that you could imagine, but we just enjoyed it so much that from that period, then after I think that was 1819, we used to go then every year. And eventually, yeah, after I finished my undergrad, then I just lived there, studying, at a place where we didn't have hot water. It was really, quite rough if you're judging it by Western standards. And yeah, so every day we would study there for 6 months. I spent some more time with him when we traveled back to Canada together for a couple of months. And um, following that, I went to law school. So I took that. It was always in the back of my head what I had studied. And after law school, then I tried. I dipped my toe into academia a little bit. I studied my master's at University of Toronto. I studied Sanskrit under Professor Ajay Rao, who's an amazing Sanskrit teacher. Quite intensive Sanskrit, how he would teach it. So just consistently memorizing stuff. But yeah, I loved it. I thought, I had that experience of being in India, being under somebody in a tradition, but then that type of study is super important. So academia gave me, it kind of opened my eyes to what was there outside of from a Sikh lens. And that's not to say that when we were studying in India, we were not looking at other things. So we were looking at texts like the Vichar Sagar, which is like a Dadu Panthi Advaita Vedanta text, So we were not only looking at Sikh literature, but studying under Ajay Rao, when we were looking at the Rāmāyaṇa, and we were looking at other texts in Sanskrit, and just the methods and the way that academics would look at certain texts and kind of contextualize them, how they would situate those in history. I found that it offered a useful lens to me when looking at a lot of this material, and I really enjoyed it. So after that, I applied to a PhD program at University of British Columbia, fortunate enough to get in, and I guess the rest is history. So I've been studying here at UBC and really enjoying it because I've been working under Harjot Oberoi as well as Anne Murphy, and yeah, I just think it's really opened my eyes as to how academia can broaden analysis, examination of these historical texts and Sikh literature.
So you talked about how when you were younger, you struggled with learning Punjabi language, but over time and in grad school, you started studying Sanskrit. Tell us a little bit more about your language training, how you maybe overcame some of those difficulties. I think that a lot of us struggle with. And also, like, what languages do you specialize in now that show up in the research that you do?
Yeah, so I struggled with Punjabi. Like, my parents spoke it at home. I would generally just respond in English, so my pronunciation was never good. I think that changed when I started going to India. I started living in India, and then just being immersed in it. Where I was studying in India, nobody spoke English, so you had to get by. So
did you study, like, did you have formal lessons in Punjabi, like reading the script, like as a kid, like at the Gurdwara or something like that? Or
oh yeah, we would go to Punjabi school, and to be honest, Punjabi school was completely useless in the way that for me personally, I never excelled in it. I always struggled in it. I think the only thing that kind of gave me some type of foundation was my father teaching me how to read certain Sikh literature when I was younger, like certain prayers. But so that gave me a certain foundation.
It's tough. And then, it's tough when you're a kid, right? If you're just being forced into it from the outside, if you don't have that internal motivation to learn it, it's really hard for it to stick, right?
Oh yeah. And I think it all ties together. I think the motivation that pushed me was I really wanted to understand what these texts were saying. And I was okay with not knowing what a lot of it meant. So I was okay with being, stupid and looking stupid in front of people when asking them questions. And I think it just took a lot of that. It took a lot of time being okay not knowing everything, and then slowly start piecing things together. And to be honest, yeah, it was just through that slow and methodical process of kind of building a foundation that I slowly started to understand more and more and more. And it's kind of this teaching style of, I feel like my teacher in India was that, listen, you're not going to understand everything. So that's okay. But just we'll slowly refine more and more things as we go through it. And I think just taking that type of mentality into these type of studies, I think really helps. And it got me to the point where, when I was younger in my teens, during that time when I struggled with language, I would often go to Sikh bookstores. I would go to bookstores in India, and I would buy a whole bunch of things that I would not even know how to read. I had no clue. I knew they were important. I had seen them perhaps written down on curriculums, or I had seen them or I'd heard them being talked about by certain scholars. So I would buy them, and then I would go through them on their level of difficulty. So the easy ones I would kind of get through, and then I would slowly work my way up. And it was just that slowly, building that foundation. The Punjabi was largely through immersion in India, just spending time there. And then, so kind of informal learning that way. But because I had grew up with it, it all started to click. And the Brajbhāṣā, so the text that I look at, the Sūraj Prakāś, and most of the literature from the 1700s, the 1800s, in a Sikh context, a vast majority of that is written in this language called Brajbhāṣā, which is kind of like an ancient Hindi. Or medieval Hindi. So how I got used to that was there would be commentaries that would, write the Punjabi meaning below the Brajbhāṣā text. So once my Punjabi was good enough, then I used that as a stepping stone to, okay, now I can read the Punjabi meanings for what the Brajbhāṣā is saying. And then slowly I started to correlate, okay, this is how certain verbs are being conjugated in Brajbhāṣā. So, as you know, in Hindi and even Punjabi, a lot of the vocab is very similar. It's just how certain grammar is utilized, how verbs are conjugated, and all that type of stuff. So once you started to pick up on, a little of these intricacies about how, the morphology is happening here, then I think it all kind of pieces together. And so, yeah, I just use these stepping stones of first understanding Punjabi, using Punjabi, then you're looking at commentaries. And then from commentaries, I started looking into the actual Brajbhāṣā. And people can do this with Hindi as well. If people are studying Sanskrit, I'm sure there's Hindi commentaries on Sanskrit texts. And then slowly, as you study Sanskrit, you can use those commentaries to kind of understand how that Sanskrit is making sense. So I think step by step is the way to go. But yeah, it takes a lot of time. Just being comfortable being terrible at it, I think, is the main key.
Can you differentiate between Punjabi and Gurmukhi?
Sure, it's a good question. So Punjabi is a language spoken, written in the Punjab area, and the Punjab area is divided currently between India and Pakistan. So there's actually more Punjabi speakers in Pakistan than there are in India. Now, Gurmukhi is the script in which you write. So like on the Yogic Studies Instagram, I think the recent post was Seva, and Seva was written in Devanagari,
right?
In a script of Devanagari, but also you had transliterated it below in an English script, I think, as well, with diacritics, I believe. So you can write Punjabi in the Gurmukhi script as a certain script, but you can also write Punjabi transliterated into English. But I think more commonly, you will find Punjabi in Pakistan written in Shahmukhi or the Perso-Arabic script. So one is a script, Gurmukhi is a script, and Punjabi is a language, and languages can be written across different scripts.
Yeah, it's an important distinction. I think in the West, especially like for English, Anglophone speakers, it's harder to differentiate between a language and a script, but in India and South Asia, there's so many scripts, right? So I think people are often surprised, especially with Sanskrit, like how many different alphabets or scripts that it can be written in. You know, a lot of the work I'm doing is on South Indian Sanskrit yoga texts, and so it's Sanskrit, but they're not written in Devanagari. They're written in Grantha, an ancient form of or medieval form of Tamil. They're in Kannada and Telugu, all these different scripts, which are it's very hard to wrap your head around all these different alphabet systems. Okay, but so Gurmukhi is this script that is it unique to the Sikh traditions? And why is there something special about that script? Why is it used? For example, tell us a little bit about the Guru Granth Sahib.
Yeah, so there have been recent scholars talking about the origins of the Gurmukhi script, but for all intents and purposes, the Gurmukhi script is kind of solely used now in a Sikh context. And in Sikh tradition, you have this idea that the gurus kind of modified certain merchant scripts that were being utilized, but they modified it for specific use in Sikh literature. So it gets associated just with Sikh writings. So you'll find the Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh scripture, which is like a collection of the writings of all the gurus and other people as well. So you'll have Sheikh Farid, a Muslim poet, and you'll also have Kabir, you have Namdev, you have other important figures who were writing as well during that time. Their writings are included in there, but they're included in the script of Gurmukhi. So there's a consistent script throughout the Guru Granth Sahib. And like I was saying, the Guru Granth Sahib is the collection of literature in a Sikh context, and Sikhs call it Guru Granth, they refer to it as a guru, because after the 10 living gurus, the last guru, Guru Gobind Singh, he said that, okay, from now on, the spiritual instruction will come from the collection of literature that we have assembled here in the Guru Granth Sahib. So it is the focus of attention. If anybody goes into a Sikh gurdwara or a place of worship, they will find in the main room there the Guru Granth Sahib on an elevated throne, if you would, and passages are recited for the congregation that comes there. These passages are sung in the form of kirtan as well, as a form of worship, devotion. So it really is the sole focus of Sikh theology, thought, philosophy. It's where Sikhs derive all their prayers from. It's where it's kind of the embodiment of the divine for many Sikhs.
All right, I want to back up a little bit. Let's do kind of just like a Sikhism 101, especially for our listeners who just might not be as familiar with this tradition. Maybe yoga practitioners or people maybe a little bit more familiar with Hindu or Buddhist traditions. So just kind of, for the lay person, for the non-academic, say, you're sitting next to somebody on a plane or, I don't know, at the ball game or something, they ask you, what is Sikhism or what is the Sikh tradition? How would you kind of give a brief introduction to what Sikhism is?
I think you start off to say that Sikhism or Sikhi is one of the world's largest religions currently. It's quite new though. It's only 500-ish years old. It started with our first guru or our first in kind of a very loose way to say prophet or messenger or teacher, spiritual teacher, Guru Nanak. So Guru Nanak was born in 1469. And he comes from this merchant class in Punjab, and he teaches this philosophy that everybody's connected, that the divine is seen through everyone, that devotional worship is one way to experience the divine, and that it's a very egalitarian type of community in which we don't put emphasis on caste, we don't put emphasis on gender. It's really we strive for charitable actions as well. So every Sikh Gurdwara has a free communal kitchen that people can go and eat at. I think Sikhism as a 101 could be that, but if going a little bit deeper, Sikhism has 10 of these spiritual instructors, 10 of these gurus. And as I said, it started from Guru Nanak, and then it goes until Guru Gobind Singh, who passes away in 1708.
And
Following that,
how were each of the gurus elected? Did the current living guru, before he passed, did he elect the subsequent guru?
Yeah, so it's a good question. The gurus worked on this system of meritocracy, in that it wasn't just their eldest son who got the title of guru. So the first guru, Guru Nanak, he doesn't choose his kids as guru. In fact, he chooses somebody else. His name becomes Guru Angad, and it's just the basis, the determination of who's going to be guru is thus that. Somebody who would have to be up for the role, somebody who embodies the teachings of the guru, somebody who's going to proliferate those teachings in a successful way. And just before the guru passes, they anoint the next person as guru, and that kind of chain of anointments continues on. So from Guru Angad, then before he passes, the second guru, he gives it to another person, Guru Amar Das, and it kind of continues on that chain all the way down until the 10th guru. So this is something we're going to get into the course. We're going to talk about the history of that. We're going to talk about the tradition of that. Is that unique to Sikhism? Is that something that is part of the customs of the time? This is all what we're going to dig into. And yeah.
Great. So tell us a little bit more about the first guru, Guru Nanak. You said he lived in the 15th century. He founded this tradition, about 500 years ago, which, as you said, it does make this, relatively a young religious faith or tradition compared to kind of the other major world religions in the world. And Guru Nanak didn't just come out of nowhere. Like he emerges in a very particular historical and religious context. So like what is his background, and then how does this new tradition emerge with his life experiences and teaching?
Yeah, so Guru Nanak comes out of this really important time in India and that region as well, because 15th century, he's born, he witnesses Babur, the emperor, the Mughal emperor, who comes into India and makes that I guess not an invasion, but that ride into India, and he sees the beginnings of that Mughal empire. And this is why Sikhism, I think, from an academic perspective, is really interesting, because it kind of mimics, kind of mirrors the timeline of the Mughal empire as well. But Guru Nanak grew up in that pre-Babur, that pre-Mughal area, time period, and he was quite a traveler. He's known for traveling all the way to Mecca, into Iraq, Iran, as far as Western Turkey. Some people talk about all the way south to Sri Lanka, all the way east to basically Bhutan, Assam, Bangladesh areas. So Guru Nanak spent his life basically traveling and preaching this message of unity. And he grew up. He was born into a merchant caste. His father, had a shop that he worked at briefly when he was younger, but it wasn't. It didn't interest the young guru, who's more inclined on spiritual matters. And through his travels, Guru Nanak was known for these discussions between different groups, different, I guess, religious leaders, as well as political leaders as well. Like he's in Sikh historiography, he's known to have met the Emperor Babur. He has a discussion with him there. Philosophically, he meets with the Nath yogis and the Siddhs, and even some of the passages that he writes. So Guru Nanak is a proficient poet as well. And along his travels, he takes a musician with him as well, a Rababi named Mardana. So they're traveling around, singing these songs of his poetry, and speaking this message about unity, about divine unity, and how to I guess reach that unity with the divine.
So sometimes Sikh tradition is kind of referred to as a syncretic tradition, in the ways in which it's kind of an amalgamation of different forms of religiosity, different traditions kind of coming together. Do you think that, like, I know it's kind of a charged word, syncretism, like in religious studies. I often like try to shy away from it. But do you think that in some ways, is it an apt description of the tradition? Or maybe another way to frame the question is kind of trying to think a little bit more about, like, what is the relationship between Sikhism and what we might call Hinduism?
Right. It's a good question, because the Sikh tradition provides for a pertinent example about how do we discuss communities, religious organizations, even philosophy during that time period. So that time period is a very interesting one. It's quite a mixed milieu of different thoughts, identities. It's not as clear cut as we would assume today, where somebody's just a Muslim and they're going to be doing Islamic things, and somebody's a Hindu, for whatever that means exactly, it's not quite clear back in the day,
that time, right?
because it's all at time. Yeah. So Sikhism, for that reason, provides an interesting, almost like an example of something that you can kind of dig into, because there have been scholars. I guess Arvind Mandar is a great example of this, who has written a very important book, Religion and the Specter of the West, where he talks about, even this question that we are considering is a result of us growing up in this context of knowing that, okay, a religion means that there's a particular box around a certain identity, a certain philosophy, a certain set of practices. And when he looks at Sikhism and how the British have kind of changed how even Sikhs have thought about their own tradition, because when the British came, they were asking, are Sikhs just Hindus? Like, do you fall under that umbrella?
Which category can we put you in for the census data, right?
Exactly. And this has caused much confusion amongst Sikhs during that early colonial period, where they then started to write literature to say, oh, no, we are a Western styled religion. We do have a box. We do have set practices and all this type of stuff.
Look, we have a sacred scripture. We have a Bible. Yeah. We have a founder in Guru Nanak, right? Here are our practices. Here is our church, right? All of the check.
Absolutely. And this is like you had on the previous Yogic Studies podcast, you were talking about yoga in that medieval period and their relationship with Bhakti and their relationship with Tantra, and that type of analysis. The Sikh context, for that question is very important, because a lot of what we assume to be unique, or what kind of Sikhs hold on to be as unique. So, for example, just to give a little bit of an example to kind of show the shared culture that we're dealing with at that time, and kind of to expand our thought beyond just Islamic and Hindu. Guru Nanak, starts off his writings with Ik Oankar, that there's one, Om, like Om, and then Kar, the creator of that Om. But that saying, that Ik Oankar, was utilized by Sufi texts, the Mirgavati in 1503. You have it in Dadupanthi, so Vaishnava devotional text from the same times in the 1600s. And you also have it in yogic texts as well, the Gorakhbani, that Ik Oankar comes up again. So during that time, you have this shared substratum where people were talking. You can talk about it in whatever way. You can call it dharma. You can call it, a spiritual conversation. But there was a level ground on which different communities could talk about ideas, could talk about philosophies, and kind of carve out their own space. Yet there was a certain connection between all of them as well. And this is going back to your question about, is this a syncretic tradition? And this is why some of the portions in the course that we'll be dealing with, perhaps in specific, the Siddh Gosht, this writing of Guru Nanak, where he's talking with these Nath yogis about the differences in their thought process or in their philosophy about spirituality, why they become so important. Because, you know, there are shared ideas and there's shared culture, and nothing comes out of a vacuum. And the Sikh tradition is an example of that, that they have to use the language that is utilized at that time. Yet at the same time, they display characteristics which would demonstrate they have a certain communal aspect to it. So Sikhs have their own places of worship. You know, Sikhs have a certain routine to their gatherings and what have you. And they have their own prayers and literature as well. So just the ways in which we think about that time in regard to what is in a certain box and what is not. I think Arvind Mandar does a really good job with that, you know, speaking how that's a really Western notion that we're bringing back into the past. And people like, even at UBC, Professor Harjot Oberoi had written this fantastic book, The Construction of Religious Boundaries, Culture, Identity, and Diversity in the Sikh Tradition, speaking about how even within the Sikh tradition, it was quite pluralistic in the past, and it left space for different thoughts, different practices to kind of have a seat at the table as well.
Well, this is one of the really unique things about this tradition. Like even the Guru Granth Sahib has all of these writings and teachings from sants or saints from different traditions. Sometimes scholars refer to the language of the Guru Granth Sahib as Sant Bhāṣā. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or like what's kind of behind that designation?
I think, you know, like you said, that designation is based on, you know, the different saints, the different sants that were writing in that time. You know, you have Kabir, you have Namdev, you have Guru Nanak and others. They're writing in a certain type of language that scholars can call it Sant Bhāṣā. For those who want to look up kind of the mechanics for that, how that works, this is a scholar from SOAS, Christopher Shackle. Shackle has written a really good book on kind of dissecting kind of the history, as well as kind of how to get to how to study the text properly, how to study that language. It's called Sacred Scripture of the Sikhs, or Sacred Language of the Sikhs, I believe. So scholars like Shackle have kind of put those terms on that as Sant Bhāṣā, but yeah, there's a shared language between these groups. So you know, Sikhs are writing in this language. You know, the Kabir Panthis are writing in this language. Namdev, these guys are writing in this language. The Gorakh Bani is written in a similar language. Even Sufi texts are written in very similar language. They're not written specifically all in Persian. They're written in this language as well. So the language itself, and even, you know, the putting of music onto this type of poetry as well is kind of a shared trait during that time as well. So Kabir and how his writings were I guess, how they were written down and how they were utilized. People would put different musical schemes on them as well, which is the same thing in the Guru Granth Sahib. The Guru Granth Sahib is organized by, in fact, not by author, but the text is organized by raga, you know, and it starts with Siri Rag, and then it goes on from there. So
what is what's the role of bhakti and devotion within the Sikh tradition? Because as you're describing, you know, in the inclusion of some of these bhakti poet saints, especially a lot of the nirgun saints, those who worship the divine, you know, without form or beyond form. You know, I think some scholars include, you know, the poetry of Guru Nanak as kind of part of this nirgun bhakti flavor and movement, if you will. You know, my fingers are in scare quotes here with movement.
Right.
How do you kind of see the Sikhi tradition vis-a-vis the category of bhakti?
I think, people have tried, scholars have often put, Sikhi underneath that umbrella of the Bhakti tradition. And this is a designation that perhaps helps them in their understanding of the tradition. Certainly, the writings of the gurus profess that, it's through devotional worship, it's through kirtan, it's through katha. Katha would be discourse. It's just another one of the forms of bhakti. So you have 9 forms of bhakti. Katha would come under shravana, I guess, like listening to devotional matters. But certainly bhakti is an important aspect of the Sikh tradition. And when I say aspect, I mean one of many. So there are also social aspects, which perhaps stem from bhakti, the sharing of food, social responsibility of working, social responsibility of standing up for people who perhaps cannot stand up for themselves, those who are unfortunate, being their defenders. Perhaps that could all be wrapped under bhakti, but again, this is just playing with semantics essentially. But certainly, bhakti and kirtan has an immense importance within the Sikh tradition. So if anybody goes into a Sikh gurdwara currently, that's what they will hear. They will hear kirtan being performed with musical instruments, the singing of passages from the Guru Granth Sahib. It is a core pillar of the foundation of the Sikh tradition, for sure.
What are some of the other kind of core practices of the Sikh faith? I mean, has they developed historically, but maybe also today?
I mean, traditionally people talk about 3 practices: Nam, Dan, Ishnan. Nam being devotional worship, the recitation of the divine name, and then Dan being charitable acts, and that can manifest through a number of different ways. It can manifest through communal kitchens, the feeding of the poor. It can manifest through protecting people who are unfortunately not able to protect themselves. And then Ishnan means bathing, right? But this is a certain cultivation of the body. So in Sikh practice, there has always been an emphasis to wake up early, a little bit before sunrise, to bathe, and then to meditate or to recite scripture. And I think those are the 3 pillars that people can talk about as the core of the foundation of the philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been struck by this emphasis of service and giving and feeding people, especially at these gurudwaras, the langar, right? This hall, the feeding hall. And at some of these big temples where they're really renowned for just feeding anybody who comes in. Doesn't matter if you're Sikh or not, you come through and you're going to be fed, right? So I'm thinking, I never made it there in my travels in India, but to the Golden Temple in Amritsar, and so it's such a shame I didn't, because I was always so close up in Himachal Pradesh, but it was like a day's journey, and we never kind of made it down there. But we'd always hear from people just these big vats of dal and rice, or these huge roti machines that are churning out like thousands and thousands of rotis, and just feeding these people coming in. It's
a big important aspect of the tradition, because I think it largely stems from this idea that and perhaps scholars might classify this as under Advaita Vedanta. Again, this is however people want to classify this, but this idea that one is not separate from the other. So if you're going to feed yourself, there should be a great importance upon feeding other people as well, and that nobody should be left hungry. And I think a lot of the philosophy kind of translates into a lot of these practices of not only helping other people, but also feeding them and providing any type of shelter for them as well. At the gurdwaras, you can do that as well. So but yeah, I know that you traveled through Himachal Pradesh. You went to the Jwalamukhi temple there.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
There's a lot of Sikh temples near there as well,
Yeah,
Anandpur Sahib and
I've
around Naina Devi.
I've met so many, Sikhs, mostly Punjabis. They always vacation up in Himachal, up at the waterfalls and bathing places there.
Mm.
So I've always had, such wonderful interactions, honestly, with Sikh communities. Often like just families traveling together. When I was traveling at that time, I had a pretty big beard. So I'd
Oh,
often
yeah.
like just get a lot of comments from young Sikh men. They'd come up and compare beards or want to feel my beard or something like that, and it was always like just kind of a cool shared thing. And actually, I wanted to ask you about that. I think one of the most visible signs of Sikh identity is for men beard, but the long hair and turban. So maybe can you just shine a little bit of light on that? Why is that an important kind of symbol of faith and Sikh identity?
Yeah, I think it also goes back to your question about, how do we understand Sikhism? Does it fall under, the category of Bhakti? Because a lot of these practices that now we're going to talk about, the keeping of the beard,
Mm,
the keeping of the long hair, the turban. For those who knows, initiated Sikhs, they also keep a kirpan. A kirpan is a type of dagger or sword. So these type of elements, they represent another side of the tradition,
mm,
which is a more martial side of the tradition. This is something as well I will be talking about in the course that um, I'll go into the history, the context of why these things came about, but just in a quick, brief answer, I guess this came about as a mandated, uh, kind of practice through the last Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, who was around that Jwalamukhi area
mm.
of Himachal Pradesh, who resided not too far from there in a place called Anandpur Sahib, and it was at that place where he mandated to the Sikhs at that time that if we are going to take this practice of helping people seriously, then we need to embody a certain martiality, a certain ethos, a warrior ethos that will sustain us and give us strength to always put ourselves in that line of fire to help people. So the hair represents it represents many things, but amongst them it represents a certain martiality that the keeping of long hair in Indic tradition, in that specific context, was associated not only with yogis and those who don't cut hair, but also
Mm.
warriors and kings, that they would never cut their hair. And the beard, in the exact same manner, you have texts from the 1700s that talk about this, explaining these traditions to Sikhs, saying that without Singhs, Sikh warriors, without their long hair and their beard, um, they almost classify them as half men in a sense. So there was this kind of warrior ethos that they were trying to bolster up within the Sikhs to kind of give them the strength to help people. And a lot of these practices, they can fall under that type of category. So a little bit different from the Bhakti oriented
Hmm.
emphasis, but some scholars talk about it being the other side of the coin.
Right, and also kind of aligns in some ways more with like the ascetic, the body cultivation kind of side of the coin. So maybe this is a kind of a nice segue into thinking a little bit about really the question of Sikhism and yoga. Um, so this is obviously going to be the theme of an entire 4-week course. So we don't want to give too much away here on the podcast, but just to kind of get us thinking about this a little bit, like what is the role of yoga within Sikh traditions? I think typically when I kind of mentioned at the top of the episode, like if you look at yoga studies, typically you don't see a lot of representation of Sikh history or figures there. Um, but I think, and I know from what we're going to discuss and the course that things have been overlooked. Well, first of all, is there a Sikh yoga tradition? Like, how do we kind of go about kind of beginning to address this question?
Yeah, it's a good question. This is something I'm going to be covering in the course. And to begin to address that question, I think we kind of need to step back a couple of steps here to first understand, how do we define yoga, especially during that time? Are we thinking about yoga from like a Lululemon type of perspective? Are we thinking of it as a postural yoga type of practice? Are we thinking of it as a more aesthetic celibate type of practice? Are we thinking of it more of, let's say, the practices associated with the Nath yogis or Hatha yoga? How are we thinking about yoga? And I think the examination begins with that. And then from there, we can kind of look at, okay, are there relationships between Sikhi and yoga, and what are the relationships? Are there discussions between these two different groups? Like, how are these two different groups speaking about notions of philosophy, notion of physical practice as well? Because, like you said, like the keeping of the hair, people associate this with a certain ascetic type of practice. Those who have gone to India and have seen ascetics with these, the matted hair and the locks of hair. Certainly, there's a resemblance there. Sikhs don't mat their hair; they keep a comb to comb it. But certainly, from that viewpoint, you can see a certain similarity. But so we're in this course. We're going to go through all of those questions to see, okay, what is the relationship? There's certainly a relationship in terms of discussion and in terms of interaction. And when we think about certain groups within Sikh tradition, for example, there's a group called the Udasis. Now, the Udasis are a group which claim lineage from Guru Nanak, the first Guru's son, Sri Chand, who was an ascetic, who just on the face of it, from looking from outside, he bears a resemblance of like a Shaivite yogi, of a Shaivite ascetic, somebody who puts ash on their body, somebody with matted hair, somebody who's always kind of roaming around, who's always beside a fire.
Are these from textual descriptions, or do we have any Mughal paintings or anything of these figures?
Unfortunately, we don't. We have paintings from the 1700s showing some of the Udasi ascetics, and they're depicted in this very fashion. And we know the Udasis had a significant importance among the Sikh tradition during that time in the 1700s and the 1800s. So, and their practices certainly resemble a lot of what people would think about Nath yogis in terms of maybe not as much importance on postural practices and in asanas, but in a certain type of yogic mindset, for sure.
Well, it's debated. It's debated how much the early Naths were doing postures. I think some of my work looking at the sculptures of yogis in South India, I think suggests that some of the Naths were, but I suspect it was a minority. But then you have like the Gorak Bani, as you mentioned earlier, this medieval Hindi text attributed to Gorak, and he's in there. You get complicated statements about yoga where sometimes it's critical of the more physical aspects of yoga, and here coming from Gorak's own mouth, so.
And this is actually something we're going to explore, in that Guru Nanak's writing in a similar way,
right?
But there are distinctions. So you have Gorak Bani, who are sometimes is critical of like certain exterior practices, in that this should be more of an internal practice. And this is, again, we're going back into that almost very gray area of discussing, okay, what practices are we going to associate with yoga, and that we can say that, okay, the Sikh tradition does have a yoga tradition in it. Now, if we were going to say that, the Sikh tradition has certain daily practices associated with asanas, associated with breathing control, I think that would be, I think most scholars would disagree with that and say, I don't think that has ever existed, but for in certain communities, such as the Udasis. And that is important because the Udasis do play an important role in Sikh tradition. And we're going to explore that role, and we're going to explore that relationship. But yeah, this is a complicated discussion because we need to understand the context of the time. We understand then, what was happening during that time. Was it just Asans? Was it even Gorak Bani? What are they alluding to? Like, what is the internal practice then, if it is not, these physical markers or characteristics that people are putting on their body?
Well, it does seem like there is this tension. This runs through other, Indian traditions as well, but this tension between householder traditions and ascetic renunciate traditions. So, those living in the world, and then those kind of renouncing family, social life, and structure, and becoming, renunciate ascetics. The Udasins, of course, kind of representing that more ascetical side. But a lot of the Sikh tradition is about teaching for householders, right?
This is what's interesting, and this is what I think we're going to have a lot of fun with the course. And is that, yeah, the gurus, all of the gurus were householders. I mean, there was one guru who passed away before he got married, but the gurus preached this idea that even within the Maya, within this illusion of the world, that within social engagement, one could be udas, one could be renounced, yet be a part of the entire system. And this was represented by their lifestyle, being married, and taking part in, and being involved in society, politically, socially, through construction of institutions, through construction of places of worship. So there's this tension because you have that householder tradition, yet within Sikh tradition, you have important Sikhs who, being dedicated to the tradition, have not taken that step to be a householder just because they're so absorbed in their duties. So, for example, Guru Nanak's son is one example of this, who started this ascetic tradition. Even where I learned, after my undergrad, I traveled to India. That scholar who I learned from, his whole life, he's been celibate. He has just dedicated himself to this study, and there's that practice within Sikh tradition that, if you are going to go down that route of being a scholar from certain institutional lineages, that almost it's encouraged to be celibate and to be kind of detached from worldly society because of just what that brings along to one's life. So there is this interesting dichotomy and tension and relationship between these two different sides. And some of the ascetic traditions that I'm going to talk about, when I talk about their practices, their mindset, it's going to resemble, I think, for people who are familiar with yogic tradition, I think it will resemble a certain side of that. It's going to mirror that very closely. So yet at the same time, we're going to look at some of the differences in literature between the Goric Nath, or attributed to him, and the writings of the Sikh gurus. So
yeah, so you mentioned earlier the Sid Gosht, and so I wanted to ask you about that because I think that's like a clear kind of textual example or case study, if you will, that kind of brings some of these issues to the fore. So, and it's a really interesting text or section of a text. So tell us a little bit about the Sid Gosht and its importance in all this.
I think the Sid Gosht is going to be really helpful for students to kind of understand perhaps the differences between what the gurus preached and what certain Siddhs or Siddh or Nath yogis were kind of presenting at that time. So the Sid Gosht is a passage, is a composition written by Guru Nanak, and kind of the historical context of that passage is this discussion where Guru Nanak, and this comes up in the life stories of Guru Nanak as well, where Guru Nanak sits down and he meets with these Nath yogis. He meets with these Siddhs, discussing, aspects of philosophy, discussing aspects of, what is the proper practice to experience the divine. And so it's kind of this question answer. It's a little bit of a back and forth between Guru Nanak and these collection of Siddhs, or these collections of these yogis. And they ask him questions like, who is your guru? What type of asana do you sit in? And what type of ash do you put on your body? All these types of questions that one would associate with yogic practice. And Guru Nanak then gives his response. These are the type of earrings that I wear. Because yogis at that time were known to kind of pierce their ears and put earrings through them. Certain types of yogis. So I think through an exploration of that, back and forth, that question answer, I think the students of the course are going to get more insight through that contrast between, Sikh philosophy and at that time the Siddh or the Nath yoga philosophy. And I think it'll expand our understanding about the relationship between the two, because certainly there was, why even bother go to them and ask them questions? Why have that discussion? There's obviously some type of relationship. That exploration will expand on that.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I can't wait to tune into that and read some more of the Siddh Gosht and discuss that fascinating text. So tell us a little bit. Who is this course aimed at? What do you hope that students will get out of this online course, Sikhism and Yoga?
I think on there'll be two types of groups I think that'll benefit from this. First, those who have an understanding, who are curious about yoga and Sikh tradition in a general sense, to see kind of what the relationship is, what's the contrast between the two. And the second audience is going to be, people who are just interested in that time period. So you did a course on Bhakti, Tantric, and yoga during the medieval period. I think Sikhi has a interesting place to play in that area as well. And I think it'll fill in a lot of the gaps in terms of understanding that area of that time period. And also just to understand kind of what the Sikh tradition promotes and how they have dealt with other groups with perhaps differing ideology or similar, but slightly nuanced difference between them. I think the audiences are going to be those two, as people who are interested in yoga and Sikhism, what the relation is, and also just people who are generally interested in Sikhism and kind of what the tradition promotes.
That's great. All right, so bringing the conversation up to present day, looking at contemporary Sikh traditions, I guess we can think about this kind of both within India and outside of India and diasporic Sikh communities. But I wanted to ask you, I guess this could be both personal experience and anecdotal, but also as a scholar of Sikh traditions. Like, what do you think is kind of the role of yoga, modern yoga today, within contemporary Sikh traditions, and how do Sikhs kind of view yoga? Now, I guess again, it always depends. Well, what do we mean by yoga, right? And so today, maybe thinking of more of like a physical postural yoga practice.
It's a good question. I don't think Sikhs associate postural yoga with their tradition in a sense that this is a certain practice that has been mandated or been even promoted by the gurus. But I think people see it within the broader Indic tradition as being, okay, this is perhaps how people used to exercise. And I think people largely contextualize postural yoga as just being that as a form of exercise. But I don't think they view it as a part of their own tradition. And this is what has been a little bit confusing for many Sikhs in India and even abroad, when they've had certain exchanges or relationships with Kundalini yoga, where that experience might have been the first time they have heard of such a practice. It's not that Yogi Bhajan was an expert of something that they knew of. A lot of Sikhs were hearing that for the first time from him. So I think, they've largely just not associated yogic practice as being a part of their own tradition.
Yeah, I think it's become a confused and complicated topic. In some ways because of 3HO and Kundalini Yoga and the kind of global brand and popularity of that. But also, I think the way that Yogi Bhajan presented this as an ancient Sikh yoga tradition, right, that has this kind of unbroken golden chain. We won't get into all that too much. Listeners can go back and listen to the episode I did with Philip Deslip, where we, really unpack that history and all of its complexities, given the controversies and abuse really that's been documented within that community. But it's interesting because it's made Sikhism more visible to the West in certain ways. You also have this then whole tradition of Western converts, of people who have gone through yoga, done teacher trainings with 3HO, and who've adopted not only the yoga practice, but really a religion and a lifestyle, and who don a turban and often all white, and often will take on a Sikh spiritual name. And it's quite unique, I would say, within the landscape of modern yoga as one of the more distinctly religious forms and explicitly Sikh forms of yoga. I'm sure many listeners today are probably actually coming from maybe a Kundalini yoga background, and I think a lot of people in that community are trying to look at the deeper history of Sikhism to see if there's kind of something there for them within this history of yoga. So there's kind of a lot there that I'm throwing at you, but I guess what I wanted to ask is kind of what do you think has been like the broader Sikh community's reception to 3HO? I guess we could answer that in two ways. One is kind of pre-controversy, and one is now maybe post. But having all of these Western converts through 3HO Kundalini Yoga becoming Sikhs, is it something people have embraced, or they look at as actually something that's outside of their own tradition because it's sort of something else that Yogi Bhajan has developed?
I think in speaking with a lot of members from the community about this, I think one aspect that I feel that they're saying is that, at first they are impressed that Yogi Bhajan is able to bring in people from the West by whatever means, so that the yoga part of it to the Sikh community, I feel like was not even relevant. I think they were thinking that, okay, if it's through yoga and they're going to bring people into the Sikh community, there's more good in it than there's bad, because yoga is just exercise, they were thinking. So they're like, whatever. But I think so, that's probably in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But I think more recently, when people have found out kind of the story behind the curtains of what was really happening there, I think people have been trying to disassociate themselves with any of that. But I think from a community level, I think people were happy that certain aspects of the Sikh tradition were being exposed, because kind of the ripple effects of what Yogi Bhajan was doing was that he was creating a community which was creating art, music, and other things like this that were kind of infiltrating just the wider yogic scene. So for example, I had friends who just go for like a random hot yoga class, and kind of the music playing in the background would be like a Sikh prayer.
It's not them
but it would,
core, right?
Yeah, right.
Huge name in the devotional music scene.
Absolutely. And comes from that tradition, right? So my friend would be like, oh, this is this is amazing, right? Like, I'm just in this hot yoga class and they have, Guru Nanak's writings being recited, his passages being recited,
And they
through whatever.
didn't care that it was coming through, white Western woman.
No, I think this is like for some of the community, they were like, whatever. If it comes through that way, it comes through that way. I think they were thinking that there's a benefit here that like how through whatever means it will benefit people. But at the same time, they had asked, the instructor of that class, who was not into 3HO, who just put the music on for whatever reason. Like, it was just on their playlist, and they had no idea what it was. They were just like, oh, I don't know, it's just on my playlist. So there's like this weird interaction between, like, people were excited that Sikhism is being exposed to a new audience, new demographic out in the West. And Yogi Bhajan had set up centers in Amritsar, so these people with their distinctive dress, all white, white turbans, the women wearing white turbans as well, it stood out, right? And then, like, that type of effect stood out, so people were like, wow, he must be doing good work, if he's getting people to be so open with taking on these markings of their religious tradition. So at first there was that acceptance and that kind of happiness in that people were being brought into the tradition. But I think nowadays, since Philip's work, and since all these other stories are coming out, I think there's a real reluctance to have any association with them. But I guess in the years passing now, we'll see how this all plays out. But yeah, I think the yoga was the least interesting part to much of the community. They said, if that's one means to get people into it, then fine.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of people I know, and kind of older generation too, maybe it was the yoga that brought them in, but they've really they've adopted the tradition beyond the yoga, and it's formed their identity and worldview and lifestyle. So I wanted to. So thanks for talking about that a little bit, because it's a complicated question, but it's really nice to get your opinion and perspective on it. And I imagine it'll be something that comes up further in the course. I think especially in the last module, where you kind of connect the history to the contemporary, to the modern day. So I think probably a lot more to be said about all of that. But I think that I thank you for kind of getting us started there. We're kind of starting to wind down here, though, Jvala. But I did want to ask you about your book that you wrote, 54 Punjabi Proverbs, which I've just seen online. Like, there's kind of this amazing reception. I see you posting on Twitter and Instagram of just kind of people engaging with the book. Even this really cool story where the Canadian politician Jagmeet Singh, who's pretty, he's become pretty famous in his own right. I saw his interview on The Breakfast Club. He was even engaging with the book. I think you were telling me you had a cool encounter with him surrounding the book. But tell us a little bit about that book, and kind of what that process was like of putting something out there that's, again, like, just like some of your other work, the podcast, the blog, trying to make this stuff really accessible to the broader Sikhi community and public.
Yeah, so this is just something that's kind of sprouted out off of my work, in my translation work, because while translating a lot of these old texts, a lot of the times translating something literally doesn't work, especially with idioms and proverbs. So that required a little extra attention when translating. So I had to dig up a lot of these, in Punjabi you call them muhavaras, a muhavara being an idiom, or a khan being a proverb, these dictionaries specifically for idioms and proverbs. And as I was going through them, I started writing some of these out. The idea came again through a suggestion from a friend that, why don't you compile this into a little small book? And
sounds like you got some good friends giving you some good advice. I think.
Yeah, that's the key, to have a good group around you who's kind of is looking into the future. But yeah, so I just kind of compiled them. They're really short and fun, and a lot of these proverbs, I think, in the Punjabi community, for us now, like I was saying, I struggled speaking Punjabi when I was a teenager. Um, I feel like that's something that a lot of people struggle with, and if they can talk to their grandparents, that type of conversation is not too detailed. It's not loaded with a lot of depth there. It's kind of like, how you doing? Do you want food and all that type of stuff, simple stuff. So what the proverb book allowed people to do, and I didn't realize this at the time, and I'm kind of amazed at the response, but once people started buying this book and showing it to their parents or grandparents, they'd be like, oh, we used to say this proverb, or I remember my grandfather saying this proverb in this funny situation. So it allowed for like a little bit of an intergenerational conversation to occur. And a lot of these proverbs kind of represent certain ideas, philosophies, kind of a mindset of the Punjabi people at that time. And yeah, I just thought it was a little fun project. And yeah, I'm kind of amazed at their response with Jagmeet Singh.
Yeah, I'm hold up. Before you get to that, I'm reading through the Amazon reviews right now. I'm scrolling through, and the reviews for the book are just amazing. I mean, congrats. But yeah, here's one. Great book, must have for all Punjabis. I just got this book today. I've read almost halfway through already. My mom enjoys the book as well and laughed a lot at some of the proverbs. I recommend this for everyone. Fun read with the family as well. So, Ivan, if you can, most academics don't get to sell a book that is going to be fun for the whole family,
Yeah, that's just something I've been kind of lucky in that. Um, yeah, so a lot of my work is not funny, it's not fun, but with this
Right.
this particular one, yeah, I think the Punjabi people have a certain comedy just infused in them, and I think it's represented through a lot of these proverbs. They have this indomitable spirit as well. It's in some of these proverbs as well, and kind of a cynicism as well to people, which comes out in these proverbs as well. So the collection is a nice mix. And yeah, what I was really amazed about is like that one you said, like that person's mother, really enjoyed it, and that's not something that I anticipated. But yeah, when these people bought it and they started reciting them to their parents or grandparents, like there was this very fun interaction that people were having that I think added a lot of value to the book, and I had really no idea it would be utilized in that way. But yeah, so it's just one of those things. You never know how a certain product or a certain idea is going to land. But even when Jagmeet Singh was visiting here in Vancouver, um, I had friends who had run as NDP um, members of parliament. So they were telling me, hey, Jagmeet's going to be at this event. Why don't you go say hello for me? And then why don't you give him one of these books? So I went to the event. Immediately, though, when he looked at me, he's like, oh, I know who you are. You're the proverb guy. And then
Wow, he
I was like,
recognized you.
because I was there to introduce myself and give him this as a gift. But turns out a friend of his who he was staying with in Vancouver, he had the book at his house just randomly. So like that night before, he was he told me he was just reading it with his wife and his friend and having a laugh. So
nice.
yeah, you never know, like who's gonna pick it up. And I even had a friend send it over to Erica Badu, and then she posted about it, saying that she really loved the book. And so I think it's not something that only Punjabis are gonna enjoy. I think it's something that I think anybody can enjoy, regardless of background.
Well, can we get Jagmeet Singh and Erica Badu to promote your course for us online? That would be nice for the numbers here. That would be great. Let's get Erica Badu, Jagmeet Singh on the next podcast here too. That would be great. Erica Badu, she's Muslim, right?
You know what? I'm not even sure her religious beliefs, but yeah, I mean, she's a legend in that scene.
No doubt. All right, Jvala. Well, I appreciate your time. This was just an awesome conversation.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, and again, we're excited for the upcoming course, YS 116, Sikhism and Yoga. It's going to run live from May 31st through June 25th, 2021. Join us live if you can, but if you're listening to this in the future, everything's recorded. It'll be available for self-study. Jvala, anything else you wanted to say or that we didn't get to touch on here at the end?
No, I think that pretty much wraps it all up. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again for inviting me to talk about kind of this relationship between the Sikh tradition and yoga. And I think people are going to enjoy it. And yeah, so looking forward to teaching it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Jvala, thanks again for being a great guest. And we'll talk soon. Okay.
Sounds great.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Yogic Studies podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes or sharing this episode with someone else. Thanks so much, everyone. Until next time, please take care.